Leah, and thank you to all of you for coming along tonight. I also would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the land that we're on tonight, but also acknowledge the Kaurna language as the language of this country as well. And I'd like to acknowledge all Indigenous people who are here today from wherever your mob. And also acknowledge all the Indigenous people who I've worked with over many, many years and who've shared with me their fascinating languages, some of which I hope I will be able to convey to you today. So my topic today is partly prompted by a conversation I had many years ago before one of my first field trips. And I was talking with a friend of mine, and I explained that I was going to work with the last speakers of an Indigenous language and record and document their language. And my friend responded and said, "But why would you go and learn a language that has only 2 speakers? Why wouldn't you go and learn French or German or Spanish or a language that you're going to be able to speak to people with? Why would you do that?" And it's not that there's anything wrong with learning French or German or Spanish. That's a very worthwhile thing to do. But I think that this question reflects an attitude and an approach to language that is very common in mainstream Australia, which is that language is really all just about its usefulness. You only bother learning a language if there's a purpose. So if you want to go and work in Spain, you learn Spanish. If it's good for your business to learn Japanese, you learn Japanese. But if most of the world speak English and you don't really need another language, then you don't bother. And you certainly don't bother if there's only a couple of people who speak it. And I think I've always found this attitude really surprising, because I've always found languages absolutely fascinating. I don't understand why other people don't find them as fascinating as I do. And I also don't understand why we don't see them as the amazing human intellectual achievements that they are. So when we think, we're quite happy to be impressed by a classic piece of literature or an amazing piece of art, and we don't question the usefulness of those. But we don't think of language in the same way, as something that is actually just fascinating and really showcases the intellectual achievements of human beings. And I think this attitude is problematic in another way as well, particularly this being the International Year of Indigenous Languages, which is that attitudes like this about Indigenous languages, or when directed towards Indigenous languages, allow mainstream Australia to not think of Indigenous languages as something they have to particularly worry about. So Indigenous languages are important to Indigenous communities, that's fine, they can worry about them, it's not really something that matters to the rest of us particularly. And I think that's a very problematic attitude for lots of reasons, but particularly because, as I'm going to show you today, I think Aboriginal languages are absolutely fascinating, and they tell us a lot about what it is to be human and the way humans think and the way humans use language, and therefore I think they actually should be of interest and important to all of us. So that's the overall message. You can now all snooze while I go through the slides, and now you know the point. Okay, so as I'm sure many people here are aware, Indigenous Australia is a place of enormous linguistic diversity. We say, some of these numbers are a bit loose, but we say that across the continent there were more than 300 distinct languages, at least 800 named language varieties across the continent. And the numbers sort of vary a bit because it really depends on what you're going to call different languages as opposed to different dialects. As far as Indigenous people are concerned, there's 800 or 900 different languages, and there's not really much more that needs to be said about that. Linguists come in and want to get technical about whether 2 things are dialects of one language or whether they're separate languages or not. That's something linguists are sort of interested in. But even if we get really, really strict as linguists about deciding when we've got different languages and when we've got different dialects, we still have over 300 completely distinct languages. And people often don't realise how much diversity there actually is in Indigenous Australia in terms of languages. So when I say over 300 distinct languages, I'm talking about languages as distinct as English and Hindi and Greek, and probably even more distinct than those in many cases, because as some of you will know, those 3 languages I just named actually are ultimately related. So of these, if we just work with this figure of 300 languages, then only about 15 are still being learned by children as their first language, and there's maybe another 80 or so that are still spoken by elderly speakers in their communities. And of course, some other languages that are in revival right now, and Ghana is one of our famous examples of that around Australia. But if you look at those numbers, that's an awful lot of language loss. That's an extraordinary amount of language loss already. And all of these languages that are still spoken, even the ones still being learned by children, are very much under threat from English. In terms of how the languages are related to each other and to other languages of the world, I think it's probably safe to say that linguists generally assume all the languages are ultimately related to each other, all of the Australian languages, except for Meriam, which is spoken right up in the eastern Torres Strait Islands. Oh, sorry, east is that side. It's the only language in the Australian political boundaries that we know is actually not related to the other languages of Australia. All of the others we assume are probably related, but it's a little hard to really prove it conclusively. And this is because of the time depth, right, that we're talking about. So just to give you a bit of perspective on that, we know that Indigenous people have been in Australia for at least 65,000 years, and probably longer than that, right? So conservative estimates are now saying 65,000 years, probably more. If we think about the way language changes, linguists have identified a language that they call Proto-Indo-European. And this is a language that all of the languages of Europe pretty much, or most of the languages of Europe, as well as languages like Sanskrit and Hindi from the subcontinent, they all developed from one language that we call Proto-Indo-European, okay? And Proto-Indo-European is estimated to have been spoken around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. So in 7,000 to 8,000 years, you go from one language to Sanskrit, Hindi, Russian, Greek, German, French, English, right? You get that much diversity and that much difference in 7,000 to 8,000 years. So now imagine what you get in 65,000 years, and you're starting to get a picture for why it's really hard for us to tell whether these languages are related and whether they're related to other languages of the world, because the time depth is so great, and we don't have written records that we can use to show us what the languages looked like 65,000 years ago. And what this means is that Australian Indigenous languages actually give us this fascinating natural laboratory of what humans can do with language over at least 65,000 years when they're relatively unimpacted by other languages around the world. And as a result, or I guess I'm assuming as a result, who knows, what we do find amongst Australian Indigenous languages is some really interesting features. They're very diverse. There's a lot of interesting and unique properties in these languages that really tell us something about how humans talk about the world, conceptualize the world, and how they express that in their language. And this is what's interesting for our understanding of how human language can work across the board. Okay. So my research, the primary research that I've focused on over the last nearly 30 years, so clearly I was 5 when I started, is the description and documentation of languages. I've pretty much only worked with communities in the Northern Territory, particularly the Wambaya, Gurindji, Bilinara, and more recently Maringar and Murimpata communities. And I've often worked with the last fluent speakers. So my work with the Wambaya, Gurindji and Bilinara people was with the last fluent speakers of those languages. And now so the work that we did together and the recordings that we made are now really all that you can know about those languages. This sort of work involves producing academic sorts of outputs like grammatical descriptions and papers about language structure and so on, but also materials that are important to communities, like dictionaries and stories and language learning resources that people can use in their local schools and so on. Okay. So why do these languages matter? Well, the most obvious answer to that question is that they are extraordinarily important to their communities. These languages matter because they are, in many respects, living archives or living museums that store knowledge and stories and histories for the communities who own those languages. They therefore give people very strong connections to their ancestry and to their community, their identity, their country, their stories. All of those things are tied up inherently in language, and that makes them extraordinarily important for people. But that's actually not what I want to focus on today. Oh, actually, before I move on, I've just given you a quote here from a Yolngu speaker, which I think sums up this sort of general feeling about language very nicely. So our language is like a pearl inside a shell. The shell is like the people that carry the language. If our language is taken away, then that would be like a pearl that is gone. We would be like an empty oyster shell. So these languages matter because they really, really, really matter to their communities. But I'm actually not going to focus on that today. What I want to focus on today is that these languages are also important to language science and to our understanding of human cognition. So I like to think of languages like the play school windows. So many of you will recognise this picture, right? So if you cast your mind back to play school, or maybe some of you have children in your lives and you're watching it daily, you will know that at some point in play school, they always look through the window and they choose the window for the day. Are we going to look through the round window today, or the square window, or the arched window? And they go through the window and something fun happens on the other side. And I think languages are like windows. So each language is another window in which its speakers are looking out on the world. Language is an extraordinary, uniquely human capacity. There is no other species that has a communication system that is anything as sophisticated as language. We know there are sophisticated animal communication systems, but they are nothing like language. There are more than 7,000 languages around the world. No other species has that sort of diversity in their communication system. And as I said, I see each of these languages as representing a different window through which its speakers look at the world. And that's part of what makes these languages so fascinating, because each language makes you look at the world and think about the world in a slightly different way. And there'll be people in this room who know what I mean. If you've ever learned another language, or if you do speak another language, you'll know what I mean. You have to think about things a little bit differently in each language, and that's part of what makes them so fascinating. And what that means is that each language gives us information about how humans can conceptualise and categorise and talk about the world. Australian Indigenous languages show, as I said, many interesting and unique properties that help us build up this puzzle we want to build up about what humans can do with language. And they're therefore very important pieces in this overall enterprise, and teach us a lot about the way humans think and the way humans use language. Okay, so let me give you some examples. One interesting way in which languages can differ is in terms of the grammatical categories that they force their speakers to express. Now, this will sound technical, but don't worry. I'm not going to go nerdy linguist on you. I'm going to take you through it. So grammatical categories are the categories, the meanings that are hardwired into the grammar of the language, so that when you speak that language, you have to pay attention to those meanings because you have no choice. So in English, for example, if I say the child runs, that I can only be talking about one child. If I say the children run, that has to mean two or more children, right? And I have a different form of the noun, it's either child or children, and I have a different form of the verb, it's either runs or run. and I have to choose one or the other. The language forces me to express the number, right? It forces me to decide, is one person doing this or a two or more people doing this? And I don't have a choice. I mean, if I want to try to say there was an unspecified number of children running around, I can do that in a very long-winded way. But I can't just say childness run or something and have it be completely vague, all right? So that's what I mean by grammatical category. In English, the grammar forces you to express the number when you're talking about people doing things. You have to indicate how many people are doing it. Now, this means as linguists, we could ask interesting questions like, or questions we find interesting, like, what is the set of meanings that languages express grammatically? Like, if we look around all languages of the world, what are the sorts of meanings that we find expressed grammatically in languages? And is there any relationship maybe between some of these grammatical categories that languages express and maybe things like cultural perspectives of the speakers of those languages? And in this domain, one of the things that's very interesting is that Australian Indigenous languages are extremely well-known or unique, unusual, I guess is a better word, amongst languages of the world in having a lot of languages which encode kinship relations in their grammar. So there's this information about how people are related to each other, and it gets encoded in the grammar. This map is just a sort of pictorial representation of all the languages around Australia that we know have some sort of kinship relation built into their grammar. It's quite a lot of languages, and we also know that Australian languages have this way more than we find in other languages of the world. So let me give you an example. One example comes from Murimpata, which is a language I'm working on, as I said, at the moment. And in Murimpata, well, let me start with English. In English, if you're going to talk about a picture like this, you might say, they are talking. I only need to tell you that there's more than one, so I have to say they. But apart from that, I don't have to tell you anything else about who these people are. I can just say they are talking, and it accurately describes this picture. In Murimpata, there's no one way to actually translate this sentence or to describe this picture, because crucially, Murimpata forces you to encode whether the people you're talking about are related as siblings or not, okay? And it's forced in the grammar. So I either have to say pirimkangeren, which means two people who are related as siblings are talking, or I have to say dimngintangeren, which means two people who are not related as siblings are talking. And I have to do one or the other. There's no general way to do it. So what that shows you is that when you speak Murimpata, you have to have at the forefront of your mind at all times how people are related to each other and whether they're related as siblings, or else you can't get the right verb out, right? In the same way that we saw that English forces you to express number, in Murimpata, you have to think about kinship relations. In fact, in Murimpata, you also have to think about number. So there's really 4 ways to translate they are talking in Murimpata. The first 2 are the ones we just saw when you're talking about 2 people. But if I'm talking about a group of people, I either say pirimngeren or pirimkangeren ngimme, depending on whether the group of people I'm talking about are related as siblings or not. So speaking Murimpata really makes you have to keep thinking about how people are related, even just to speak the language. Another example of kinship in grammar is from Lardell, which has kinship distinctions built into its pronouns. So these are the words that translate things like we and you and they in English. And what Lardell does is it takes all the relations that you might have and divides them into 2 groups. And I've called these even generations and odd generations. So in one group, you group together all of your kin that are on your generation level, so cousins and siblings and spouses, and your grandparents who are 2 generations above you, and your grandchildren who are 2 generations below you, all of those kin are one group. And then the other group is all the other ones. So the people who are 1 generation above or below, so your parents or your children, and then the great-grandparents and great-grandchildren. They're all grouped into the odd generations. And there are 2 sets of pronouns that reflect these generational groupings. So every time you're talking about a group of people, you need to choose the right pronoun to indicate whether those people are related through even generations or odd generations. So for example, if I'm talking to my child or my nephew or my parent, so someone who's 1 generation above or below me, and I want to say, let's go west, I have to use this pronoun, nyangi wabara, because that's the odd generation pronoun. If I'm speaking to my sister or my cousin or my grandmother or my grandchild, so someone who's in an even generation to me, I actually have to say nyari wabara. It's a totally different pronoun because we're now related through even generations. And this means that there's 16 pronouns in Ladil that translate we, you, and they in English. And it also shows you how to speak Ladil. You need to have at the forefront of your mind how everybody's related, because otherwise it can't just be whether they're siblings or not. It's got to be generational levels and everything so that you know how to talk about people properly. All right, another interesting thing that we find in languages is case marking. Many Australian languages have case marking, and these are markers that go on nouns to indicate what job that noun is doing in the sentence. Is it the subject, or is it the location, and so on. Lots of languages have case marking. If you have learned German, or you did Latin at school, or you speak Turkish or Hungarian, you will have come across case marking before. But if you haven't, don't worry, because I'm going to explain it. This is all you need to know about it for the purposes of my talk. So in English, we use word order to tell you who's doing what in the sentence. So if I say, what's my example here? If I say the child is chasing the dog, then you know that the child is the thing doing the chasing and the dog is the thing being chased, because I put the words in that order. If I say the dog is chasing the child, it means something different. Now the dog's doing the chasing, okay? So in English, you do it just with word order. But another way you can do it is with case marking. So a sort of pretend English with case marking might be where I would say the child is chasing the dog, but I would put a little marker on child to tell you I'm the thing doing the action. So if we have a look at Wambaya, in Wambaya, if I want to say the child chased the dog, I would say alinginigina nyura nyura jandi. But in fact, and as you can see, alingini, the word for child, has this little ni on the end to tell you it's the thing doing the chasing. And janji has a g on the end to tell you it's the thing being chased. And in fact, in Wambaya, I can put these words in any order I like, and it will still mean the child is chasing the dog, and it will still be grammatical. So I can say, nyura nyura gen alingini janji, or janji gen alingini nyura nyura, or any other permutation of those words. Now clearly that works in a very, very different way from a language like English, where you need to be paying attention to the order in which you put things. In Wambaya, you don't have to worry so much about the order as long as you get the endings right. If you want to actually say the dog chased the child, you don't have to change the word order. I mean, you can, but you don't have to. But instead what you do is you just change the endings. So if we say aladigina nyoro nyoro janyini, now it's the dog doing the chasing because it's got the ni marker on it, and it's the child being chased because it's got the g marker on it. Now, if you learned Latin at school, or you know a language with case marking, you will have learned that every noun in a sentence has one case marker on it. That was what we always, that's just a fact about language. It's actually built into many theories of language that nouns will just have one case marker on them. And it's what was assumed to be universal to language. For a very, very long time, until we learned about what happens in some Indigenous languages of Australia. So to show you what we discovered, firstly you need to know that nouns can sometimes have ambiguous roles in the sentence. So have a look at this joke from Groucho Marx. So one morning I shot an elephant in my pyjamas. How we got into my pyjamas, I'll never know. Sorry, I don't quite have the Groucho Marx delivery, but anyway. Now the humour here lies in the interpretation of my pyjamas, basically. We know that it's a location because we've got in my pyjamas, but we don't, apart from that, we don't know what is being located in the pyjamas, right? In English, it's potentially ambiguous. It could be the elephant that's in the pyjamas, or it could be me that's in the pyjamas, or it could be all of us in the pyjamas, and that's where the joke comes from. Okay, so these sorts of structures in English are ambiguous. We don't really bother specifying. We just let context or something else sort it out for you, and mostly we manage to cope just fine. But if we look at some Aboriginal languages, they have a really ingenious way of dealing with this ambiguity. So let's have a look at Warlpiri. And I've switched to talking about kangaroos and rocks because I couldn't find words for elephant and pyjamas in Warlpiri. So if we take this sentence, Jabbanunga shot at the kangaroo, you can see we've got Jabbanunga is being marked as the thing that's doing the action, and kangaroo has a little case marker on it to say it's the thing being shot at. And this is, and then we can say, well, what happens if we say Jabbanunga shot at the kangaroo on the rock? This is like our elephant in the pyjamas example, because it could be that the kangaroo's on the rock, or it could be that Jabbanunga's on the rock, right? In English, English doesn't tell us one way or the other. Well, what happens in Warlpiri? Well, the Warlpiri people do something really, really cool. So there are two ways in which you would translate that sentence in Warlpiri. So let's have a look at the word for rock. Here you've got rock, it's got its own case marker telling you it's the location. But then ingeniously, what you do is you put an extra case marker on the end to tell you who's actually on the rock. So if I say Jabbanunga shot at the kangaroo and then I say Pilinga ku, the ku on the end here is the same as the ku on kangaroo, so that can only mean the kangaroo was on the rock. If I want to say Jabbanunga's on the rock, I have to put the little dua marker on the end to tell you that it's Jabbanunga on the rock. Now this is a really cool, you have to admit it's a cool, ingenious way of using your language resources to really be very specific about these structures. It's not something that we knew existed. It's not something that we knew languages could do or that humans would do with language, except for discovering it in these Indigenous languages in Australia. Okay, so another type of grammatical complexity that we find among Australian languages is in languages of Northern Australia. There are languages like Gunwingu, Andiliagwa, Tiwi, Murimpata, which is the one I've given you some examples of already. And these languages have extremely complex verbs that can pack in a whole lot of information into one word that in English you would need to use a whole sentence to describe. Linguists call these sorts of languages polysynthetic languages, but don't worry about that for now. The point is that in these languages, so let's say you're trying to describe a situation where maybe we're all here, we've all left our bags outside the room there, and then we look out and we see that there's one person going through all our bags and stealing stuff from them. In English, you would need to use a big long sentence like I just did to explain that. In Murimpata, you would say this. And I'm going to play it to you. Okay. So that's one word. It's packed full of lots and lots of suffixes and prefixes that build up a whole lot of really complex meanings. And what it means that with one word you can express what takes this big long sentence in English. So this means he was going through our bags and stealing things from us who are not related as siblings, right? Because this is Murimpata, don't forget. All right, here's some other examples because they're just so cool. I'll play them again. So that came out of a story where the woman Carmelita who was telling me the story was talking about in her childhood days, and she and some of her friends were being naughty and doing things they weren't supposed to be doing, and they thought they were getting away with it until they turned around and saw that there was an old man lying there pretending to be asleep, but actually he was lying like this with his arm over his eyes, and he was watching them from underneath his arm. And you can express that with a whole word. So he was sneakily watching us who were not related as siblings by putting his arm across his eyes but looking out underneath. And the last one, because I love the sound of it. So that's describing this picture here where there's a woman making the girl's hair. I guess in English we'd say she's doing her hair. Now, these are pretty amazing verbs and pretty amazing structures, and obviously very, very different from a language like English or European languages that we might be more familiar with. And clearly a language that works like this must work in very different ways from a language like English or French or German. And this raises really interesting questions about how language is processed and how language is learned. Is it the same to speak a language like this in terms of what's happening in your brain and how you process language as it is to speak a language like English? Or do children learning Murimpata learn Murimpata in the same way as English learning children learn English? And for a long time, the language acquisition literature has talked about there being a sort of universal way in which children go about learning their first language, and there are developmental stages and so on that children go through in language learning. But all of that research is based on children learning English and French and German and maybe Japanese if people get very exotic. But there is no research really on how children go about learning languages that work like this. And really, to really properly understand how language is learned, we need to know how all languages are learned, and especially languages that work so differently. It might be that Murimpata speaking children go through exactly the same process as English speaking children, or it might be that you have to learn a language like this in a very different way, and we don't actually know. We do know that English learning children don't learn anything like this level of complexity in terms of putting all these bits and pieces together in one word until much later in their learning process, maybe 5 or 6 or even later. So then the question is, well, does that mean that Murimpata speaking kids maybe don't learn Murimpata properly until they're much older because these structures are so much harder, or not? We don't know. So in order to answer these questions, or start to answer these questions, we've had a project running with Murimpata learning children in Warea, where we're actually trying to look at how Murimpata speaking kids learn Murimpata, because it's one of the languages, one of the 15 or so languages that is still being learned by kids as a first language. So we go up to Warea, we make these little backpacks that we put on the kids, and that has you can see the little microphone there, and the little wireless bit sits in this bit, whatever you call that, sits in the backpack, and the kids can run around and play and do what they want to do, and we can record their language, obviously with parents' permission. We were a little concerned when we first started this project that the children would be really reluctant to wear the backpacks and be very resistant to wearing the backpacks. In fact, it turned out that the backpacks were so popular that we ended up having to then make placebo backpacks for the kids who weren't being recorded, just so everyone got to run around wearing a backpack. So that ended up not being a problem. We can't have too many kids that we're recording at once, or it's impossible to transcribe it. So we just had to have little placebo backpacks, and the kids didn't know who was being recorded and who wasn't. So it all worked out fine. So we take them out on country, and we set up some video cameras, and we have their caregivers with them. This is Carmelita, whose voice you heard earlier saying those big long verbs. And we record them and we have a look at their language. Well, what have we discovered? Well, firstly, we've discovered that big verbs are hard, and children do sometimes find them very difficult. And I'm going to play you this example, which is one of my favourites. So this is a 3-year-old child. You're going to hear the adult say this big long verb, so tangara werwaradim, and then she'll say tama. And tama means you do it. And this is a very common way of teaching language to children and teaching language to visiting white fellow linguists as well. So people will just give you this massive long verb in just full flight and then go tama, and you're supposed to just be able to repeat it all. So anyway, you'll see how the child goes. So listen. I'll do it again. So I know how that kid feels. I speak Murimpata like a 3-year-old. So big verbs are hard. There is no doubt about it. However, all jokes aside, what we did discover is that children can actually do a lot of more complexity than we expected at younger ages than we expected. And certainly younger ages than we would expect English acquiring children to have this sort of complexity in their words. So here's an example. This is a child who's 3, just over 3, and they say this verb that has, as you can see, 4 different bits in it. They've put the bits together correctly, they've put the bits in the right order, and the verb means you wash your face first. So they're building up complex meanings. I'll play it to you just because the voices are so sweet. And then this is another child, 3.5. Again, a number of different bits to the verb, all put together correctly. They're all the examples I have. And so the important point here is that we don't find this level of what we would call morphological complexity, so building up complex words, in English-speaking or English-acquiring children at the age of 3 or 3.5. We find it later on, but not at this age. And this was surprising for us. So in fact, what we found is that Murimpata-acquiring children have acquired a lot of complexity by 3 years old in terms of this grammatical complexity. And they can produce really quite long adult-like verbs with very few errors. And in fact, what we think this is showing, and there is some other research that also suggests this as well, we think that this shows that actually children adapt their learning processes to learn the type of language they're hearing around them. And this, once you say it, seems really obvious, but in fact, this is a really monumental sort of finding in terms of the way we're used to thinking about how language acquisition works. So in fact, the suggestion is that the learning process in the brain is able to, and this is in very small children, is able to identify what's important for the language I'm learning and focus on that first, and then learn other things later on. So English acquiring children can get away with an awful lot without worrying about big complex words. You can just do it with word order and sentences and all the other things that we've seen for English. So English acquiring children focus on that first because they know that's the main thing they need to learn. Whereas Murimpata acquiring children know or work out early on that they can't get anywhere until they've got some of these big verbs sorted out, so they go ahead and focus on that. And so what we find then is that actually word complexity is acquired early in a language where you need it, and acquired later in a language when you don't need it. And that's pretty amazing if you think about what that tells us about the capabilities of the human brain in a 1-year-old or 2-year-old child, that the brain is capable of recognizing the typology of the language that it's hearing around them and focusing on that and learning that first. And we would not have come to these realizations if we weren't able to learn about these amazing Indigenous languages. Okay, so I'm just going to finish now with keep looking at words, but now instead of looking at really complex words with all the bits and pieces of suffixes and affixes and how you can build them up, another thing that's really fascinating about language is actually just to look at what are the concepts that get expressed with a single word in different languages. And this is often just a really fun thing about learning another language. So you're like, wow, they've got a word for this concept that I've never thought you'd need a word for that. That's really cool. And it tells us something. It's coming back to the window idea. It's helping us see how each language is a different window that you're looking out at the world through. So I'm just going to end with some of my favourite examples of words across different languages of Australia. I made that point. It reminds us again about language being a possible windows. So firstly, we find languages that reflect cultural practices. So in Wambaya, there is this word, damangaina, and it means a woman who's cut off her hair in mourning for her child. Now, we don't have a word for that in English because it's not something that is part of our cultural practice. But a word like that in Wambaya tells us something about that culture and what people do in that culture in that particular situation. Here's another word from Cooktayor, a language from Cape York. So this word means to go from one place to another via an indirect route so that you don't walk past someone that you're in a taboo relationship with. So in Cooktayor, as in most Indigenous cultures Australian cultures that I'm aware of, there are certain kinship relations that need to keep a distance from each other. Often a very strong one is mother-in-law and son-in-law, which perhaps some people in our culture might like to bring in too, I don't know. And mothers-in-law and sons-in-law often can't be near each other. So you need to, if you're a son-in-law and you need to get somewhere, you might have to do this. You might need to go on a very circuitous route to get to where you need to go because you're not allowed to pass your mother-in-law. Now, we don't need a word for something like that, obviously, in English, but having a word like that tells us something about the culture of the people who speak this language. We also find words that reflect knowledge of the environment. So this is an example from Maratil. In Maratil, there's a particular tree that is called miwengi, and mi means edible, something that's edible, and wengi means cloud. So you might think, well, why would you call a tree an edible cloud? That seems a little bit odd. Well, in fact, tied up in that word is the fact that this particular tree fruits in the build-up season, which is when all the clouds are building up in the sky before the rain comes. So there's in fact a very direct environmental relationship between getting fruit from this tree and the build-up of clouds in the sky. And this relationship is actually tied up in the language. And this is the sort of stuff that doesn't get translated when you just try to translate things into other languages, all this knowledge gets lost. It's one of the reasons why we really need to try to preserve these languages. This is one of my favourite examples from Biningunwok. So we might think that there's just one way to hop, but in fact in Biningunwok you have different verbs for the hopping action of different types of kangaroos, wallabies, euros and wallaroos. I mean, I didn't know that those creatures hopped in different ways. I certainly would never have known that a female antilopine kangaroo hopped differently from a male antilopine kangaroo. But obviously they do, because you wouldn't create different words for them unless you needed it, right? So what this amazing array of verbs meaning different types of hopping, part of what that tells us is something about the way these creatures are, which we may not have even noticed or known about if we didn't find these words and wonder what they meant. There's words that might be useful. So in Wambai Bunjurbi, I often think this might be good. You know, when you're getting into a lecture theatre or something and you're having to push past people? That might be useful. This next one, anyone who's got teenagers in their life at the moment might find this one useful. So nujungama, to be off in one's own world, sitting, not paying attention to the conversation around them. You know, we might need a word like that. Instead of saying, get off your phones, blah, 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 we can just say, don't nujungama, right? Be much more efficient. I like this one, manarpa, the tiredness of a pregnant woman. And anyone in the room who's experienced pregnancy will know why you need a special word for that sort of tiredness, because it's something very, very different. And then finally, again from Biningunwok, this is just the most extraordinary word, burmalala, which is the name for a male antilopine kangaroo that is resting, lying on its side in part shade during the heat of the day, and the movement of the dappled light on its fur gives it the appearance of having covered itself with white clay, just like hunters do when they hunt these large animals. So you've got cultural information, you've got environmental information, you've got so much knowledge tied up just there in the meaning of that one word. Okay, so my take-home message is that language diversity showcases the intellectual creativity of humans. Each language in the world is a different design solution to tackle the enormous challenge of trying to convey our thoughts in a way that someone else will understand. And in the genius of Australian Indigenous languages, we see really unique and fascinating design solutions that actually really enhance our knowledge of how language works and how humans think and talk about the world around them. And for this reason, I think that these languages are a really important part of Australia's linguistic landscape and should be valued by all of us. So thank you.